Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Well, many thanks for joining us on the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast today. We're really excited to be joined by Amanda Sturgeon. She's an award-winning architect focusing on education projects that connect people and nature. She has created some of the world's most sustainable and regenerative projects. Amanda is also a global keynote speaker, and she has a fantastic TED Talk, bringing biophilic design to life. Amanda is author of Creating Biophilic Buildings, and her essay, Buildings Designed for Life, appears in the anthology All We Can Save: Truth, Courage and Solutions for Climate Change. She was elected as Fellow of the American Institute of Architects in 2013 and named as a US Green Building Council Lead Fellow in 2014. In 2015, Amanda was named as one of the top women in the 10 top women in sustainability. And in November 23, Amanda became CEO of the Biomimicry Institute. We're going to be exploring how biomimicry and biophilic design sit alongside each other, and also how architecture needs to change to embrace these principles for people and planet. But first of all, Amanda, many thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, lovely to be with you. Thanks for the invitation to have the conversation today.
Lovely, Amanda. Thanks so much. Well, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, about your practice, what you do? That would be a bit about your background as well, maybe. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Well, as you mentioned, I was an architect by background, spent 15 years or so in practice. And then, really, I felt like there were some underlying principles to architecture that needed to shift massively. So I moved a bit more into advocacy, if you like, through nonprofit sector. I led the International Living Future Institute, where I was there for about 10 years. I've done some consulting since then, and I'm currently, like you mentioned, just over a year ago, I joined as CEO of the Biomimicry Institute. And I guess my career trajectory has really been about I'm on a mission to connect people and nature in the built environment, in our cities, and the places that we spend all of our time in. It just never made sense to me from before I became an architect why we shut people off from nature, from the beauty of and brilliance of the natural world, and why we sort of insist on separating ourselves and seeing ourselves as separate from versus part of, and having a relationship with. So I think I was really loath to myself kind of go into an office and be cut off from nature from the very beginning, and really noticed whenever that happened, if I didn't have the ability to track daylight in a day or understand what the weather was doing or smell the smells of a season, I felt that sort of change in my mood, my happiness, my productivity, and noticed that happening with others around me as well. So it's been a mission of mine to change the way that we're designing buildings currently, and reawaken that relationship with nature that I think is within all of us, but has often been sort of closed off.
Yeah, fantastic. And what was the trigger for you to the nature connection? Was it something from an early age, or where did it come from? What was the thing that kind of started you off?
I grew up in kind of a small, village outside of London. We definitely did, we were in a small cul-de-sac surrounded by fields and green belt, and spent a lot of time outside. So definitely, I think spending the time outside as a young person as an influence, but really the big influence was when I went and traveled for a few years through Australia, through Southeast Asia, and spent nearly all of my time outside. And also, I think, especially throughout Southeast Asia, learning about architecture and buildings that were really interconnected with culture, place, and natural systems, and responding to sort of the climate of that space. I've never really seen before then, growing up in England, this sort of adaptive type of architecture that, can address humid, hot conditions, or, be passively kind of cooled or heated. And yeah, it just really struck me the relationship that was between people, buildings, culture, and the natural environment during that sort of time when I was traveling. And yeah, developed a love of, of the natural world through my travels, and wanted to be able to create and influence buildings and spaces that could embrace that. So yeah, I suppose it was, a time outside as a child, but then really in my early 20s being influenced by traveling the world and having new experiences of that sort of cultural implication of what buildings connected with nature and people could look like.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it? When you do travel, it does open your eyes, doesn't it? You do see how things are. I remember going out to North Africa, and it was just outside, well, just outside Morocco. But the buildings, the roof, there was sort of like a natural tower that literally that cooled the air as the as the wind blew off the Sahara sort of thing, and it just went round this tower and then cooled this which would have been a boiling hot room. It was just I'm like. Why aren't all buildings done like that? And of course, people are doing that now. They're putting them into buildings here, obviously orientating the hole, as it were, when the wind comes in. I think it's phenomenal, really.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we used to, before the last sort of 120 years or so,
Yeah,
um, before the sort of onset of, unlimited electricity. We used to, right,
yeah,
adapt our buildings to the light and heat and the resources that were available in that place. And then it rapidly changed. And I think we can learn a lot from looking at how buildings used to adapt to climate and looking at traditional indigenous ways of building. Um,
yeah,
and yeah, sometimes we do now see that sort of people learning from that sort of approach, but more often, the majority of architecture now is really about investment, maximizing footprints,
yeah,
um, and that often involves big fat floor plates that squeeze as much in as possible without any sort of regard to daylight or the natural climate.
mm,
So yeah, I think there's a lot of room for architecture to improve and to once again sort of maximize the passive abilities that could be possible in a place, but also be more place-based. We shouldn't be seeing the same mirrored,
yeah,
you know, towers with all glass in every
yeah,
climate in the world, for example. So
yeah.
yeah, I'd love to see a big shift in architecture. We've still got a long way to go, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's happening, but it's like just needs a fast forward button, I think. Biophilic design then. What does biophilic design mean to you? And why obviously we're discussing it really, I suppose now. But why is it important right now as well?
Yeah, well, for me, it starts with place-based, understanding the place and reestablishing, reawakening the relationship between people and the natural environment. And that place doesn't just include the natural ecology and climate, but it also includes the culture and community.
Mm,
And so it really, for me, starts with place-based, being able to make that connection. And that's where, I think quite a lot of people think, well, biophilic design is about bringing plants inside, or it's about having water features or, green walls. Yeah, that could be a way to interpret place or to bring it inside. That could be part of a component. But predominantly place-based architecture, I think, is much broader than, the aspects of nature you bring inside or that you sort of mimic to bring it side. It's about having a comprehensive relationship with the place and the ecology and the climate. And so that's what it is for me. I think in the book that I did that you mentioned, Creating Biophilic Buildings, I used Stephen Kellett's framework, which I thought was quite comprehensive of sort of the 6 different elements, that go from place-based all the way through to, yes, literally bringing in fresh air, daylight, wind, fire, water, and all the way through to looking at the relationships in nature that allow us to have a sense of calm or excitement, such as the prospect and refuge, which is, the better known one of those, or mystery and awe and wonder and all of those experiences, those sort of feelings that we have in nature. How do we create spaces that also have that sort of variety of experience in them? So yeah, I think Kellett's, when I first went through Kellett's, and I know he created it with several other people as well, set of elements, for me, I felt that it was the most comprehensive outline. And I know people have tried to abbreviate them or sort of condense them into smaller numbers, but I actually feel having a wider palette of what that could look like it was really helpful for me, coming from a design perspective, at least, when I was an architect. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think we need all of the elements in a building, or in terms of biophilic design, in terms of like, say the Kellett's framework, do you think we need all of those, all the biophilic design elements, or
I was really curious about that when I did the book and a series of case studies. I was curious about whether, so my idea was, let's look at a bunch of case studies, and sort of see where the themes were. And what I noticed is that typically projects, you can sort of see 3 of the 6 appear. I didn't come across any projects in my group in case studies where you could say all 6, the whole list of things are there. And I don't think it's supposed to be for me, that framework or that list of elements is best used as, if you like, a sort of menu versus like everything has to be in there. Because again, it should relate to the place, right? And the context and the use of the building as well. And so I came to the conclusion that, at least sort of 3 of them were predominantly kind of there. Then you could really see the difference from it being a regular sort of building just performing to a program given by a client, and a building that's really starting to establish or reestablish that relationship between people and nature, and be more place-based in its response. So 3 plus was sort of what I came up with, so it might be a building that's really focused on, beautiful natural ventilation, moments of fire and water and natural materials, but also has sort of, if you like, central focal points and abilities to have, awe and wonder, or abilities also maybe to bring in natural features such as curved walls or spaces, or more natural textures, sounds, and really be sort of multi-information richness, multi-sensory. So yeah, I think it would be lovely to see a project that was sort of meaningfully using each sort of element in a really meaningful way. I think in the ones I've studied in the book, and then sort of since, really, and before, I think it's rare to still find a project that I would say this is completely biophilic. It's, that was the complete driver of the project, versus it being something that was sort of added in and considered. Yeah, I think it would be wonderful to see a lot more projects that really use a framework like that with a bit more intentionality. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The ones I'm coming across, in the residential ones, they seem to have a bit more freedom. And I don't know if that's to do with budget or mindset of the clients, but more than like sort of, public realm, or, larger sort of business buildings. But I do want to move on to biomimicry. I think some of our listeners probably know what biomimicry is, but just in case people are like, what exactly is that? We're going to talk about the overlap in a minute, but what is biomimicry, and how can people kind of like, find out about it or something? So
Yeah. Well, biomimicry is basically learning from the brilliance of nature to change the way we make the world, from the big picture perspective. So it's understanding the systems, processes, behaviors of natural systems and natural species, and then learning from that to change the way that we might behave in the world, whether that be through things that we make, whether that be through the spaces we create, and really also whether that be through the sort of social structures we form for each other. We think there's also a lot of amazing potential for biomimicry to influence, how we might develop leadership structures, or how we might be able to think about the way we relate to each other, and build things like trust, or sort of full sharing of resources. And I think some of that is only just sort of starting to really be utilized in a way that in the potential that it could have. Yeah, so, there's a lot of similarities, people think, between biophilia and biomimicry. Often people are like, what's the difference, is the biggest question that I get. And I would say that, they're both ultimately about learning from nature. So I think that's the commonality. They're about reestablishing the relationship with nature. The first component of biomimicry is about reconnecting. And that's where I see biophilia and biomimicry really having parallels. That reconnecting, the understanding of natural systems, the understanding of place is critical for biophilic design. I think it's critical to understand what's your watershed doing, what's the climate, what's the unique ecology of this place, how is that emulated throughout the building. So I do think that fundamentally that reconnection, the understanding of nature, natural systems is really in common between biophilia and biomimicry. I would say where they diverge is that biophilia then becomes much more of a, right, it's place-based, it's about the context of often a building, a city, a community space. And biomimicry could be applied, like I said, to social structures, to things that we make, to new forms of chemistry, to, all kinds of, kind of new inventions, if you like, as well as the building spaces, environment, and city sort of sites, etc. So yeah, so they're really, I see, I've been drawing a diagram lately where they sort of really have the common root of reconnecting, reawakening that relationship between people and nature, and that understanding of the brilliance of nature. And then they kind of take them into different paradigms, and then have some sort of overlaps in some of those spaces as well. So yeah, it's been really fun to sort of be fully in the biomimicry world over the last year, now running the Biomimicry Institute after spending a long time really being focused on biophilic design. I was drawn to biomimicry very early on as well. I first met Janine in like 1998 when I asked her to come give a talk on her book, and I did several of the early kind of biomimicry courses and workshops. It was definitely a really big influence for me in thinking about biophilic design and how that applied to buildings. So yeah, it's work that I've followed all of my career and has been really at the sort of center of, of my inspiration. So now leading the Institute is, really, really fantastic way for me to sort of, I think, also think about these two components simultaneously.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that I really love about biomimicry and how it fits in with biophilic design, are things like, if you're creating like solar shading or something like that, and you're mimicking like the leaves outside or whatever, you know what I mean? I think how you can pick up sort of biomorphic forms. I don't know, now going into a different word, but if sort of this word, things that we're mimicking life, sort of biomimicry, and then we can put that, transform that into design, which is then like a perfect, for me, would be a perfect biophilic design element if you're going to put it in as patterns or as shapes or as curves or whatever it is, or biomorphic forms. I mean, we talk about the shell, that classic sort of inside the shell shape, stairwells, all that kind of thing. I think for me they kind of sit together. I mean, you kind of explained, do you have any examples maybe that you could share with us that where the two kind of like have come together? The people can maybe go,
Yeah, I mean, we were talking, I think maybe even before earlier about, structures, for example, that use the sort of termite mound, or, throughout Middle Eastern cultures, right, that use sort of chimneys to bring in cool air from below and allow hot air to escape. I mean, though, people have used the sort of idea of biomimicry in that context and said, okay, we're using biomimicry to mimic the termite mound and the way that it behaves. For example, we've seen that a lot in quite a lot of buildings. In traditional architecture and indigenous architecture, it's been used extensively. And then also we see people using it or referencing to it in biophilic design and saying that, this is really about us, having natural ventilation, connecting to the place and being able to adapt to the climate. So it's sort of like one solution, if you like, that sort of comes from multiple different influences. I've seen that happen. Some people talk about it as a biomimetic solution. Some people talk about it as a biophilic solution, one that's, connecting to place. And I suppose it doesn't really matter, but that's where I think is a great example of how biomimicry and biophilic design have the same purpose, which is to connect to the place, be climatically responsible, if you like, and influenced by the local climate and conditions of that place. And that's what a natural system in a place would do as well. Of course, it's evolved in reaction to its conditions. So, and it creates conditions that are conducive to life. Similar for biophilic design. So there are many elements, I think, of the two that have the same purpose, have the same origin, have the same philosophy. The termite mound, though, is an interesting one for me. I've seen so many people refer to it as biophilic design solution, and also so many talk about it as a biomimetic one. So
yeah, exactly. I think when I first learned about biophilia, it almost it sort of like seemed to sit above everything because it means love of life, and living systems, living patterns, everything. So it's kind of like a biophilia way of life is kind of embracing all of this lovely stuff that that connects us, like you just said, to life, to nature, to living systems, each other as well. I mean, that's something that I often always talk about is like, there's the social systems. We forget about that. So creating community spaces where people can be and hang out, that are, that do have like nice trees or plants or water sound or whatever it is, but encourages people to go and sit there. And obviously they've got to be released by their boss. There's also another thing, isn't it? It's like, oh yeah, we've created this thing, but you're not allowed to leave your desk. It's like, okay. So it's all this culture shift, isn't it? So which again, if you go looking at biomimicry or systems, that like ants and how everything has a pecking order or whatever, but everything's allowed to go and do what it needs to do when it needs to do it in the place it needs to do it in. So yeah, we can learn a lot by that. So it's really interesting. I hadn't made that connection before with biomimicry, so that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think with both fields, we're really only just, I mean, I feel like it's just passing the startup phase, for both, that we've developed the language, the taxonomies, the, examples, there's case studies, we're writing about it. We've got, scientific proof of health benefits, in the biophilic design case, right? And productivity benefits. But in terms of seeing it sort of then reach its full potential, right, of how it could really shape the world we live in, I think we're only just getting started. So
yeah, absolutely. I do want to talk about like a sort of snapshot of where we are now in your TED Talk, which is brilliant. Again, I'm going to put a link to the spiel that goes with this podcast, so listeners do go and check it out. But you describe barren tombs of buildings, which I thought was just a brilliant line. When we spend when we spend time in them, and we work in them, live and we learn in them, we become, and I'm inverted commas, shadows of ourselves. Can you explain maybe how the majority of buildings we use day to day affect us? And then obviously maybe we can, maybe you've got an example, but then maybe we could look at, a sort of like in a contrast, an example. But yeah.
yeah, well, I think it shows up mostly, in the office building, but in schools and hospitals. Those are the ones that we've got, the most, I think, poignant data as well, and studies on that prove that, when you just have a window to the outside or even a picture of outside, that, you need less pain medication and you can heal faster, for example. So those early studies that looked at the impacts of just a view on health recovery, I think were quite profound. And then the same, of course, with schools, looking at, improvements in test scores, which, start to show that, the productivity and focus increases when you can see outside. So, yeah, I mean, I think, I had the misfortune in my early career before I found architecture to spend a lot of time in sort of like finance and office settings that, had no windows at all and were just cubicle farms essentially. And like I said, you emerge at the end of the day and you don't know whether it rained or
No.
what time of day it was, windstorm, you wouldn't know, and found myself really getting really shifting in terms of my mood, my sense of happiness. And so I experienced it sort of personally, but yes, that unfortunately, and I think globally, the statistics are about 60 to 70% of people who work in offices don't really have access to daylight, certainly not to fresh air. And just the ability to hear birds singing or the wind in the trees, the sound of the rain. Even to be able to hear just sort of voices or children playing down below or in the distance, it's all something that creates a, sensory richness for us that helps us to connect to our place, to our circadian rhythm. So yeah, we have sort of shut all that off in our bid to, I think there was a fantastic series of podcasts actually that Outrage and Optimism did that Christiana Figueres program did last year. Yeah, last year, maybe mid last year, that just talked about how did we get here? How did we get this separation from nature? And they talk about it being quite a sort of, intentional thing that sort of came through various different religions as well as different social and cultural beliefs. And really, if we had not have distanced ourselves from nature, we probably couldn't have caused the destruction that we have. We would have cared too much. We would have been too connected to have mowed down forests, whole ecosystems, destroyed indigenous cultures. And so this sort of sterilization, if you like, between us and nature was necessary for us to have the kind of industrial revolution we had. So that's portrayed in our buildings. We cut people off intentionally. I once did a project for the Hawaiian public schools, and it was amazing to go to public schools there in such a beautiful place with such a benign climate, essentially where you could be outside all day, every day. There were no windows. The windows were high up on the wall so that kids wouldn't be distracted. And, there were then just sort of air conditioning pumping in. All you really needed was an open-air structure for instruction in that climate. You really didn't need any of the rest of it. But certainly, even if you had a building, you could have had windows open, connection to outside. And yeah, I mean, and that was pretty common, in many parts of the world to have kids not distracted by the outside. And I think it's led to really poor learning outcomes and really poor social outcomes as well. So yeah, I hope we're past at least that phase. That seemed to be a 1970s thing, the best I could tell in my research. We seem to have at least accepted that, good daylight is a good thing in schools, predominantly, but I'm sure there are still some parts of the world where that approach still happens.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do think of them as tombs. I mean, it might sound a bit dramatic or depressing, but really they seem to be many of those buildings seem to be a place where, people's souls or spirits or imagination goes to die.
Yes.
Um, and yeah, there's no sense of love of life or thriving in those kinds of places.
No, exactly. No, I totally agree with you. And we forget as well, I talk about that a lot, but we forget that schools and hospitals are also workplaces. So, while it's bad for the patients and while it's bad for the kids not learning, those teachers are there 24/7, they're there maybe for 10 years or whatever it is. And, it's just, yeah, the people where their soul and their creativity goes to die, actually. I think you nailed it. It kind of really stuck out, actually. Barren tombs of buildings. We don't want to be doing that anymore. Definitely not. No. Um, so in contrast, then, sort of shifting onto like this, our lovely biophilia and biomorphism. The sort of colors, the prospect, refuge, curves. Movement as well is a massive thing, isn't it? You know, you go into these buildings and there is no movement. There's nothing. It is sterile in so many ways. And you know, if when I go into buildings and you know people kind of ask me to come in and I'll sort of consult with with the small c. But you know, there's no movement. You know, they create these beautiful spaces, but there's nothing. It's like there's nothing. There's no. I might put an artificial plant in the wind. But it obviously that doesn't move because there's no natural light, and if there is natural light, that doesn't move. So, do you have any examples maybe of where? Maybe it was, I mean, it could be healthcare, whatever it is, but where there wasn't any biomimicry or biophilia and what it was like, and then when it's been introduced, the difference, the contrast.
Um, yeah, I mean, there were some early studies, I think, by Gail Brager at, UC Berkeley. And I know that BRE in the UK also have done some great studies, right, with their own building and looking at adding various different biophilic design features
Yeah.
and then sort of studying the staff and their sort of productivity outputs. I do think that quite a lot of the tech companies, given that many of them have embraced biophilic design strategies and given that their staff's productivity is their biggest cost to their companies, have done studies, but they'll all be proprietary. So I do think it's an area I would love to see. I mean, I would love to see more public sharing of that data. I do think there's a lot of opportunity for there to be, if you like, a sort of more public database that can look at various different sort of strategies or components of biophilic design, and if you like, sort of provide some kind of measurement or guidance on the ability for that to impact people's, whether that be a productivity measure, where that's appropriate, or whether that be a health outcome. I think it's tricky to get that data. It'd have to be anonymized. I've talked to several big companies in the past about could we provide some kind of, generalized database. I think there's a need for it. Would love to see it emerge. I mean, I think we know, you and I, and I'm sure many of your listeners, readers know intuitively from our
Yeah.
own experiences or from seeing, the impacts on our loved ones or our co-workers, for example. But often to persuade people to do it, they want to see measurements of improvement. And yeah, I think there's room for us to be capturing more of that. At the moment, we have to go with sort of common sense, right? Of like, and the studies that we have that I referenced before, there's about 30 or so sort of really sort of controlled studies that I think give us enough evidence for us to be able to work our way into the door, if you like, to make the case. But there's definitely a big gap in terms of really, really good, solid, continual sort of research and experimentation in this space.
Yeah, exactly. At our first Biophilic Design conference at the Barbican in November last year, there was a recording. Bill Browning did a recording, and he said that when he first started up, he made a pitch to this company, and they said, "Why would I pay you to do, to study something that was intuitively obvious?" And then he said he spent the last 30 years trying to prove the intuitively obvious, which is kind of what we're all doing. We do have a thing on our website actually where and we're just fine-tuning. It's in beta at the moment, but you can put in a search term and it will pull up all the references from the journals, from the past 12 journals. So you can find case studies and evidence, that we've published. So at least that's the start. So you can produce a PDF that's got all that stuff on it. So at least it's, that's something. And going down the line, we might be expanding that, but it'd be great to work with, other sort of publishers and stuff as well to kind of accelerate that, of support where we can. So really, I suppose before we get to the final bit, for you, how and why would you like to see architecture really playing a part in the health and well-being of people and planet and prosperity, obviously, but obviously our main thing, people and planet, which obviously brings about prosperity. So
Yeah, well, I think I think the architecture of the last, I'm going to say 40, 50 years has really been about some brilliant idea or concept that the individual, mostly male, has. and is then sort of bringing to the world, right, as some sort of hero on a horse that emerges from the fog, and I think, the time for that has passed. We know the impacts that buildings have on, climate change, on, toxicity. We haven't even scratched the surface of the impact that they have on biodiversity, but, that's coming quickly. It's a huge responsibility that architects have to be able to start to address some of these major poly crises that are on a collision course at the moment. And the sort of idea of the romantic concept that, is about, I don't know, it looks like a shoe from wherever, or whatever it might be, a random concept that comes out of nowhere, I think has to die quickly. And we really have to be looking at architecture that responds purely to the place, to the natural ecosystems, and is resilient, because we're going to be facing some extreme weather events. We already are. We're going to see sort of, I think, quite a lot of social change, and we need buildings that are going to be able to, survive without power, that are going to be able to harvest water and share it with the community, that are going to be able to be places of refuge, that are also going to be places of, spiritual, uplifting, whether that be in daily work, let alone sort of places of worship. So, I think we need to require our architects to do a lot more for society from the buildings that they're creating. Not just for society, but for natural systems, for all living systems, and to be designing not just with people in mind, but be designing with entire natural living systems in mind. How do their buildings provide healthy habitats for all the species of that place, not just people? And yeah, it's quite a revolution that's needed in the way that we educate architects, the way that we train them, the way that we certify them, license them, allow them to operate. And I think the architects, not to just, I'm an architect, so I feel like I can give them a hard time. But of course, architects will also say, well, it's the clients, and it's what they're asking for. And I agree. I think property developers, building owners, I mean, anyone involved in the building process, insurers, all need to step up, and start thinking about these as, sort of critical infrastructure for the future for everybody. And it's tough because, our pension plans and retirement plans have been woven up in investing in buildings. Nearly everybody you talk to that wants to retire with some sort of financial independence will have exposure in these types of property developments. So we're all culpable. And while our economic system is interwoven to buildings being, for long-term stable sort of investments for people's retirement, it's going to be very hard for them to change.
Yeah.
And certainly not change quickly. So it's a very challenging problem, I think, the building space. And it's a tough one, and it's very slow to move, I think. But at the same time, there's great examples of buildings that relate to place that are, creating what a real sort of thriving place-based bioregional approach could look like. So they're out there, they're models for the future. And I think, it's not like we don't know how to do this. I think we do. We just need to get it to happen faster.
Yeah, exactly. We had Robert Gardner from Rebalance Earth, and he's trying to do exactly that, trying to shift pension fund money into rewilding projects, but actually urban rewilding projects. But the way he's done it, because he worked in pension funds, and he's trying to shift that model, the economic model, and so that they're urban rewilding. So it's not like, sort of, getting some random bits of land elsewhere. It's actually like bringing particularly water, so water cleansing and all this kind of thing. So it's really interesting. So I think, companies like his, I think are springing up as they're seeing this need, and also the ethical desire I think that's a huge thing, don't you? I think that it's got to come from the drivers, ultimately has to come from, like the building owners or the pension fund owners or whatever it is.
Yeah, yeah, I do agree. I think, and I do see that moving in places. I do
Yeah.
see that sort of moving. I see there being some big pension funds, that we've talked to around integrating, a general biomimicry sort of approach to
Yeah.
their investments. How are they learning from natural systems?
Yeah.
What could that sharing of wealth that's, resilient look like? So yeah, I definitely do see some movement there, especially within the European sort of investment retirement funds, and a little bit in Australia, less so in the US, but I'm sure they're there.
Yeah, somewhere. Yeah. Well, lovely. Well, before I ask you the final magic question, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Oh, well, I think, I think what's really needed, one of the reasons why I started some years ago when I was at the Living Future, the Biophilic Design sort of, advisory group was to bring, anyone working in this space together to share knowledge, to share learnings, to basically sort of evolve this type of work. And
Mm.
so I guess just the last thing is that I love that's, what you're doing here is to bring more voices together, people to be able to share from each other in a very open platform. Yeah, I just think that's really needed. And we want to raise the awareness of biophilic design as something that's integrated into every project from the beginning as a key priority, as key as any other component of a project. And it's really about a change in the way that we design and think about how we create our world. Ultimately, it's not about something that we add after a building designed or on the side of a project. So I think the more we can spread the education and knowledge and awareness, the better. So yeah, I guess a real thanks to what everybody that's engaged with your work is doing, and real appreciation of the sharing of ideas. Yeah.
Lovely. We're back at you. So final question, Amanda. If you could paint the world with a magic brush of biophilia and biomimicry, maybe, what would it look like?
Yeah, well, it would look like forests that have people and, places within them versus, barren cities that have a little few trees and nature in them. So I would love to reverse the gray to be green, and if you like, the sort of little bits of green we have now, especially at the city scale, to be the gray. And I think if we approach that way, we would find that we could actually have the same amount of space that we needed. I think we would have, probably a more creative way of using our space. So we don't have a separate space for work and a separate space for home and a separate space for worship and a separate space for gathering. I think we would be more creative with our space creation. And I think that we would be able to find a space in which people and all other living systems could live together harmoniously, in a symbiotic relationship. So I do honestly believe that that's possible. I worked with a bunch of collaborators to create a report called Nature Positive Sydney with a committee for Sydney that laid out really clear ways that we could get there. That's just one city, but there's so many other people doing amazing work like that. Like you mentioned, some of the rewilding work in the UK that's really, really fantastic. I think it's possible to get there, but we have to approach each project more from the green perspective, the living systems perspective, and then how do we work within it to create the spaces or buildings that we need versus the other way around.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.